I started using Bumble in early May of last year. It wasn't my first stint on dating apps, but it had been a few years at that point. One of the first guys I matched with was Leon, and his profile said he was looking for friends only, nothing romantic. That was what I was looking for too, because I didn't want any pressure since I was coming out of a serious relationship. We messaged for a few days before he asked if I wanted to grab a drink. I agreed, mostly because he seemed easy to talk to and didn't push for anything romantic. We met at a cocktail bar downtown that I liked because it was quiet on weeknights. I got there first and picked a corner table near the window. Leon showed up 10 minutes late, which kinda bugged me. He was taller than I expected and wore a button-up shirt that still had creases from the packaging. He shook my hand, ordered a whiskey sour, and asked if I'd been on the app long. At first the conversation was fine, if not a little bit boring. He asked where I was from, what I did for work, what kind of movies I liked. But after half an hour, his questions changed. He asked how many people I dated recently, and if I'd ever been with anyone adventurous. I laughed it off at first, thinking he was trying to joke, but he kept going. When I didn't answer one of his questions, he said I was hard to read and smiled in a way that made me uncomfortable. I told him I needed to get going and asked for the check. He offered to walk me to my car, but I said I was fine. When we got outside, he asked if I wanted to do this again sometime. I said no. He smiled without saying a word and walked off towards the parking lot. A week went by, and I didn't hear from him. But then, one Friday evening, I came home from work at around 8. It was still light out, and the street was quiet. My house was a small 2-bedroom townhouse with a white front gate I'd painted that summer. When I got out of my car, I noticed the gate was half open. I never left it that way because it scraped against the walkway when it swung. When I got closer, I saw that the latch was bent and there were fresh marks on the wood where it looked like someone had forced it. I stopped halfway up the path and looked towards the front door. The porch light was off, and the blinds in the living room window were slightly crooked, like they'd been moved. I didn't go inside. I turned around, got back in my car, and drove straight to my friend Maurice's apartment, a few blocks away. She let me in without question. I told her what happened, and she handed me her phone to call the police. When the officers arrived, they asked me to stay put while they checked the house. They were there for almost 20 minutes before one of them came back out. One of the cops said they'd found someone inside, asleep in my bed. They told me to stay back while they took him out. I went across the street with Marissa and watched as a man was dragged out my front door in handcuffs. It was Leon. He'd broken in through the kitchen window and made himself comfortable, like he lived there. I stayed with Marissa for a week while I replaced my locks and had a security system installed. Leon stayed in jail until his hearing, and I didn't have to testify because he pleaded guilty. He got 6 months and a restraining order that barred him from contacting me or coming within 100 meters of my house. When I finally went home, everything looked normal again, and it was strange how quickly the feeling of safety came back. I would have thought it would be too hard to stay there, but for whatever reason, I still loved that house. I deleted Bumble and didn't look back. That was enough socializing for a while. I'd been in Medellin, Colombia for about 3 months when I finally joined a dating app. I'd met a few people through it already, and while most dates were awkward or forgettable, none were outright bad. However, the woman I met that night was named Daniela. The profile photo showed her smiling on a beach, wearing sunglasses and holding a drink. We agreed to meet at a restaurant near Parque Lleras. It was one of those quiet places with outdoor seating, and there were slow fans turning overhead. When she walked in, I recognized her right away, but she looked thinner and more nervous than in her photos. She smiled when she saw me, but it was quick and forced, like she wasn't sure if she was supposed to. She barely said anything for the first 10 minutes, and her voice never rose above a whisper. Every time I asked her something, she glanced towards the street or over my shoulder before answering. I asked if she was okay, and she nodded too quickly, smiling again in that stiff, uncomfortable way. I tried to keep the conversation going and talked about travel, the food, and I asked how long she'd lived in the city, but she only responded with short answers and never asked follow-ups. When the waiter came to take our order, she kept her hands folded tightly in her lap and didn't look up. She ordered a salad in Spanish so quietly that the waiter had to lean in to hear. After he walked away, she said something about not being used to meeting foreigners, but even that sounded rehearsed. Half an hour in, I decided I'd had enough. She looked like she wanted the night to be over too, so I decided to do us both a favor. I told her I was going to call it a night, and that's when she suddenly reached across the table and grabbed my wrist. Her nails dug into my skin, and her voice finally came out loudly. "Please don't go yet," she said. "Please just sit a little longer." I asked her what was wrong. She looked terrified, and her eyes darted to a table near the back of the restaurant. I followed her gaze and saw two men sitting there, both dressed in dark shirts, not eating, just watching us. One of them picked up his phone when he saw me looking. I looked at her again and realized she wasn't on a normal date. She was scared of them, whoever they were. She looked at me again and said quietly, "Please, just pretend we're fine." We sat there for another 20 minutes, pretending to talk, while the two men stayed where they were. I asked her again what was really going on, keeping my voice low. She said that she didn't have a choice about being there. I asked her what she meant. She said she owed them money. If I left too early, they'd think she'd done something wrong. She kept glancing at the men as she talked. I asked if she wanted me to help her leave. She shook her head fast and said, "No, that'll make it worse." I didn't want to cause a scene, but I also didn't want to sit there pretending everything was fine. I told her we could just finish the drinks and leave slowly. She nodded, but I could tell she didn't believe it would go that easily. When the bill came, I paid and stood up. She hesitated before standing too. The men at the other table stood at the same time, and I told her I'd walk her out. Her hand was shaking as she grabbed her purse. We walked down the block toward the main road. I turned once and saw the two men again, maybe 50 feet back. Daniela noticed too, and said quietly, "Please just go home, don't get involved." I wanted to ask her what they'd do if I didn't, but I already knew it wouldn't matter. At the corner, she stopped and looked at me with that same forced smile. "Thank you for dinner," she said, loud enough for anyone nearby to hear. Then she turned and walked down another street without looking back. The men followed her for a second, then one of them turned towards me instead. I walked faster, trying to act normal. When I turned onto the street where my apartment was, I realized they were still behind me. One of them called out something in Spanish, but I didn't turn around. I was only a few doors from my building when one of them started running. I got my keys out just in time, and as I pushed the door open, the closer one grabbed the handle and tried to shove his way in. I threw my shoulder against the door and forced it shut. Through the glass, I saw the guy close up for the first time. He stood there for a second, then raised his hand, and he was holding a zip tie and a black flashlight. I awkwardly sidestepped out of his view and went up to my apartment. I called the police, but by then, the men were gone, and they didn't even bother to show up. I canceled the apartment lease a few days later and moved to a different part of town. I stopped using the app completely. A few weeks later, I met a local guy at a cafe who'd lived there his whole life. When I told him what happened, he said it wasn't unusual. Some groups recruit women for jobs and use them to set up robberies or kidnappings. He said I was lucky I'd locked the door fast enough. After that, I kept to myself and avoided anyone who I didn't already know. I still thought about Daniela sometimes, wondering if she ever got away from them or if she just moved on to the next job. I met a guy named Luke on a Saturday night when I went out with a few friends from work. We ended up at a crowded bar that played old pop songs. The place was loud and packed, and people kept bumping into each other near the dance floor. I had just enough to drink to feel social, and when a guy asked if I wanted to dance, I said sure. He was tall, clean-cut, and had a smile that made him seem harmless. He wasn't pushy, and he actually listened when I talked, which must have been hard in a place like that. We stayed together most of the night. We danced, shouted small talk over the music, and took breaks at the bar where he bought us both drinks. He told me he worked as an intern for a law firm, but it was really boring. He was easy to talk to, and I remember thinking he was one of the more normal people I'd met in a while. When the bar was closing, he asked for my number. I hesitated, not because I didn't like him, but because I'd had my share of bad experiences with guys who seemed nice at first. Still, he didn't come across as pushy or sleazy. I gave him my number and went home thinking it might actually be worth a chance. He texted the next day, asking if I wanted to get dinner later in the week. We agreed to meet at a Thai restaurant. When I got there, he was already waiting with a drink in front of him. He stood up when I came in, smiled, and pulled my chair out for me. At first, everything seemed fine. He was polite and said he was glad I came. But as we started talking, he came across different than before. He wasn't relaxed like he'd been at the bar. He was sharper, more serious, and intense about everything we discussed. When I mentioned my job, he asked a lot of questions about it and made comments about how he thought people in my field were often too trusting. I laughed it off, but something about the way he said it made me uncomfortable. The longer dinner went on, the stranger he seemed. He didn't smile much, and he watched me closely, almost like he was studying me. When the check came, I reached for my purse, but he stopped me. "I've got it," he said firmly. "I don't mind splitting," I told him. He smiled again, but it looked forced. "You don't owe anything now," he said. I laughed, trying to make it light. "All right, if you insist." When we walked out of the restaurant, the air was cool and the parking lot was almost empty. A few cars were scattered near the back, and the lights buzzed quietly overhead. I thanked him for dinner and said I should get going. He smiled again, but didn't move. "You know," he said, "I'm glad you came out tonight. I was worried you might not show." "Yeah," I said. "It was nice to catch up." He took a step closer. "It was more than nice. I think we really have something." I didn't know what to say because we'd only met twice. I tried to keep it friendly, though. It was fun hanging out, but I should go. I have an early morning. As I turned towards my car, he grabbed my arm and I looked at him confused. "Actually," he said quietly, "you do owe me." I tried to laugh, thinking he was joking. "I bought you dinner," he said. "You know what that means." His face didn't show any hint of humor. He just stared at me, waiting for something. I eventually managed to struggle free, and I stepped back, but he followed, blocking my path. He reached for my arm again, and got me even tighter this time. I told him to stop, louder now, hoping someone might hear. He leaned in closer. "Don't make this difficult," he whispered. I tried to push past him, but he shifted to block me again. The lot was almost empty, except for a couple getting into a car across the way. I yelled for help, and that finally made him hesitate. The couple turned and started walking towards us, asking if everything was okay. Luke stepped back, but didn't leave right away. He glared at them and then looked at me. "You're overreacting," he said flatly. "I was just joking." The man from the couple came between us and told him to back off. Luke stood there a second longer before walking quickly towards his own car. He got in and drove off without another word. The couple stayed with me while I called the police. Over the next few days, I blocked his number and deleted our texts. I kept thinking about how normal he'd seemed that first night at the bar. It made me realize how easily someone could hide who they really were behind a friendly face. Looking back, I was lucky that the couple was there. Things could have gone differently if they hadn't been. Sometimes when I drive by that restaurant, I think about how normal the night started and how fast it changed. I went out with some of my friends on Friday night after work. It wasn't a place I usually went, but a few of the girls convinced me to join them for drinks. I was bored sitting at our table alone while most of my friends were off dancing. That was when I saw a guy sitting 2 tables away, alone. He saw me too and walked over, then struck up a conversation. He told me that he worked in real estate, mostly rental properties, that he was trying to unwind after a long week. He was average height but stocky, with a neatly trimmed beard and a calm, confident voice. He asked questions about my job and my family, but nothing too personal. By the time he offered to buy me another drink, I'd already decided he seemed normal enough. We talked for about an hour before my coworkers said they were heading out. He asked if I wanted to stay a little longer, and I did. When I finally left, he walked me to my car and asked if I'd want to get dinner sometime the following week. I gave him my number, figuring it couldn't hurt. Our first date was at a new Italian place near the river. He was polite and easy to talk to, and he listened when I talked about my work as a dental assistant. He said he liked that I was practical and down to earth, which sounded like a compliment, but also oddly rehearsed. Still, I didn't think much of it. He didn't seem nervous or awkward, just very sure of himself. We went out again the next weekend, this time to a microbrewery that he liked. The night went smoothly, though I noticed he avoided talking about his own family. When I asked about them, he just said they weren't close and changed the subject. By the third date, I was comfortable enough to let him pick me up. He had a dark gray SUV that was spotless inside, almost unnaturally so. He said he liked keeping things in order, and I laughed, saying he'd hate how messy my car was. That night, we went to a steakhouse about an hour away. It was a nice dinner. He made a few dry jokes and teased me for ordering my steak medium well, but he wasn't rude. It was already past 10 when we got back on the road. I leaned against the window, scrolling through my phone as we talked about random things. The streets were quiet as we left the city, and for a while, I wasn't paying much attention to where we were going. It wasn't until I looked up and saw unfamiliar street signs that I realized something felt off. At first, I thought he might have just taken a wrong turn. We weren't far from the highway, and I figured maybe he was trying to avoid traffic. But after another few minutes, I noticed we were heading away from the city lights. The streets were darker, the houses spaced farther apart. "Hey," I said, trying to sound casual. "This isn't the way back." He glanced at me and smiled like it was nothing. "I know a faster route," he said. That didn't make sense, though. We weren't even on the same side of town anymore. I pulled up the GPS, but my phone battery was almost gone. "I don't think this connects to the highway," I said. He laughed and said, "Trust me, I drive around here all the time." I looked out the window again. There were no cars behind us, and no streetlights ahead. "Can you just take the regular way, please?" He didn't answer, and his hands tightened on the wheel. The SUV's locks clicked, and I realized the child lock was on. I tried the handle just to check, but it didn't move. My phone died not long after that. The screen went black, and I regretted not charging it more before I left. I stayed quiet for a while, trying to think of something to say that wouldn't make things worse. He started talking again, but his tone had changed. "So you live alone, right?" he asked. "Why?" I answered. "Just curious. You said your family's not nearby," he quipped. I didn't remember telling him that, so I said nothing. Then he asked what time I usually left for work, whether I walked or drove, if I ever jogged in the mornings. When I didn't answer again, he started tapping his fingers on the steering wheel, like he was getting irritated. "I'm just trying to make conversation," he said. We passed a sign for a storage facility, and then nothing but trees for a mile. I didn't see any lights until we came to an intersection. He slowed down there, and as he turned, I noticed a lit building in the distance, a restaurant from the looks of it. I reached for the door handle again, but it was still locked. He stopped the car at the side of the road and leaned forward, pretending to check something on the dashboard. The moment his hand left the gear shift, I pushed the handle as hard as I could. The door popped open, and I jumped out before he could grab me. The ground was uneven, but I ran anyway, shouting for help. The restaurant looked half closed, but the lights were still on inside. I could hear Jim's door open behind me, but I didn't turn around. I ran across the gravel lot and pounded on the glass door of the restaurant until someone came. A young man in a server's uniform unlocked it halfway and asked, "What's going on?" "Someone's after me. Please call the police," I blurted out. He let me in right away. 2 other employees were stacking chairs on tables, and one of them grabbed the phone to call the police. I stayed near the counter, trying to catch my breath. Through the window, I could see Jim's SUV parked across the street. His headlights were still on, but he didn't get out. The police arrived about 10 minutes later, and Jim was still there when they pulled up. They questioned us both separately. I told them everything, but Jim denied it all. He said I'd gotten confused and overreacted when he took a different way back. He gave them permission to search his car, but didn't find anything suspicious. One of the officers told me they couldn't charge him with anything, since I wasn't hurt and he hadn't technically broken any laws. They let him go, but one of the restaurant employees stayed with me until a friend came to pick me up. That was pretty much the end of it. I never heard from him again, and I obviously never contacted him, either. I still wonder where he was taking me, and what might have happened there. There's no doubt in my mind that he was up to something, but I still don't know how bad it would have been.